Blunt says he put his conscience before his country. He says there must have been more communist spies. Good evening. Mr. Anthony Blunt, the former spy for the Russians, came out of hiding and told his story today. He said he'd put his conscience before his country in working for the Russians. He said Guy Burgess, the spy who's dead, had recruited him, not the other way round. He said the Official Secrets Act prevented him from saying whether or not he recruited spies when later he became a Don at Cambridge. But he said there must have been more spies. He said Kim Philby, the double agent, now a general in the Russian spy service, warned Burgess and Maclean to get out of Britain. He denied that he'd tipped them off. He thinks that though he was the Queen's advisor on art, she was not told that he'd spied for Russia. And he said that giving information to the Russians was an appalling mistake. But he did not expose any British agents. This is the nub of his statement today.
I was persuaded by Guy Burgess that I could best serve the cause of anti-fascism by joining him in his work for the Russians. This was a case of political conscience against loyalty to country. I chose conscience. When later I realized the true facts about Russia, I was prevented from taking any action by personal loyalty. I could not denounce my friends. In 1964, an event took place which meant that I was no longer bound by this loyalty, and being promised immunity, I was relieved to give the authorities all the information in my possession. From 1945, I ceased to pass information to the Russians, but in 1951, I was in contact with them on behalf of Burgess. I was myself pressed to go to Russia. I refused.
Blunt insisted on several restrictions at his press conference, which was held in the offices of the Times. Journalists from the Times and the Guardian were the only newspaper men allowed to interview him. Their interview was then made available to the national news agency, the Press Association. Blunt gave ITN and the BBC interviews after he made his statement, but restricted them to 10 minutes each. Paul Tilsley spoke to him for ITN, and here's that interview in full.
If I could ask you, first of all, it seems that it's likely you will lose your Fellowship of Trinity College now, and you've already lost your knighthood. What do you feel about being plain Mr. Blunt now?
I've no objection to that at all. I do very much mind the idea of losing my Fellowship of Trinity.
Can I ask you who recruited you in the first place?
Well, I've implied, I think, in my statement that it was Guy Burgess who persuaded me to work, and that, I think, is an answer to your question, isn't it?
But
the answer is, yeah, is Guy Burgess.
But was he then the master talent spotter at Cambridge at that time?
No, there wasn't one.
How many people were recruited at that time?
At that time, only the three that we know about and myself.
Did you have a homosexual relationship with Burgess, either Burgess or Maclean?
No, absolutely no.
So the Russians were not able to use that as a lever against you?
No.
Were any lives put at risk during the war when you were inside MI5 and also working for the Russians?
But, owing to me?
Yes.
I think the answer to that is categorically no.
What kind of work were you doing for the Russians then inside the MI5?
The information that I passed to them was almost exclusively about German intelligence services. And that was largely information which, again, as I said in my statement, a lot of people in MI5 thought ought to have been given officially. I had, in fact, no information about none about British agents at all, when I wasn't connected with that aspect of, with the section of MI5 that would have been connected with that aspect of MI6, so to speak, at all. And I had no information about military defences or military, anything to do really with the military side.
And moving a little later now, you say that you did not, in fact, tip Maclean or Burgess off.
No.
Who do you think did?
Well, they knew. I think the story of Boyle's about knowing the exact date at which Maclean was going to be interviewed is probably a canard, and I don't think they knew. Philby obviously tipped them off, that he was going to be interviewed or interrogated, and very soon. But I had no contact with my old colleagues in MI5 at that time, nor even if I had, could I possibly have put that kind of question to them. I mean, this would have been top secret. And I mean, first of all, I couldn't have, and secondly, I didn't.
You say you were offered a trip to Russia. You were invited to go to Russia. What form did that offer come in?
An order to leave.
From Russia?
Yes.
Why didn't you accept it?
Because I had by that time totally disillusioned. And, well, the process of thought that I remember going through was that I would rather spend another month even in danger in England than 10 years in Russia.
Did your conscience at any time during the war years bother you, the fact that you were working for two masters?
During the greater part of the war, of course, the two masters were allies. And therefore, although naturally it was a moral worry, it wasn't too acute.
How about immediately after the war?
Well, then I wasn't working for the Russians. I mean, my contact, to all intents and purposes, ceased in '45. And it was at that time, of course, that I began to realize what an appalling mistake I'd made.
When you came to confess, how many times had you been interviewed up until that time by the security services?
I don't know. As soon as Burgess and Maclean went, I was in contact with them, and we had, all I can say is, a great many discussions. I saw that one newspaper said I'd been interrogated 11 times. Well, the number is meaningless to me. But I was in close contact with them.
Why did you confess? Were you forced to?
As I said, I suddenly found that my particular problem of loyalty to friends was, so to speak, dissolved.
So you chose to confess. They did not have evidence against you which forced that confession.
They had some evidence this is something that I unfortunately can't discuss in detail because it would mean revealing what are quite definitely official secrets.
What sort of deal did they come up with, though? Did they promise you immunity?
Yes. And just that.
Were other deals done with other people at that time that you know about?
I can't answer that.
Were there other men? George Young at the weekend said that there were 8 other people.
There must have been other people, obviously.
Is the 5th man dead?
This story of the 5th man is a complete mystery to me. I don't know, this was, you're referring to Brown Sewell's statement, yes. I don't know what he means. I haven't had an opportunity of talking to him about it. I have absolutely no idea what he means or who he's referring to or what his evidence is.
But was there a 5th man operating in Washington at that time?
Not that I know of. Oh, you mean the Boyle 5th man? No, that was total news to me. And I had never heard anything of that kind.
When you made your confession, did the Queen know?
Well, this is a question again which I would rather not discuss because my information is, so to speak, if not second-hand, is rather vague. And I can only say that as far as I was told at the time, and later, she was not. But I may be wrong about this. That was what I was told.
What about other ministers?
I understood, and again I'm simply quoting what I was told at the time, I was told that the decision had been made at the highest level, by which I took it. In fact, I think I was told specifically meant the then Prime Minister.
You seem to be an interesting psychological study in that on one side you were working for the Russians, on the other side you had reached an accepted and honoured position, and yet you seemed imperturbed by it. Were you?
When you say honoured position, you mean?
I mean both in MI5 and then later in life with the royal household.
Well, well, in the royal household, of course, I'd already totally broken Therefore, the conflict was not actual, so to speak. In the case of MI5, when I joined MI5, my loyalties were certainly still with the Russians. By the time I left it, they were changing.
After 1964, you were still working with and for the royal family. How did you reconcile that with the fact that you are a traitor?
Simply, you may say this is schizophrenic, but I felt that I'd been given a job to do, and I felt I could go on doing it for the Royal Collection.
How do you feel about being called a traitor now?
I can't deny it.
Do you feel like a traitor? Do you feel you have betrayed Britain?
I feel that I haven't betrayed my conscience.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that I originally, I realized I made an appalling mistake, but I acted according to my conscience in doing this in whenever it was, 35, 36. And that meant disloyalty to this country. But as I've said, I believed it was the right thing in the cause of anti-fascism. I now realize bitterly this was totally wrong.
So you do have regrets?
Oh yes, bitter.
What will you do now?
I hope to be able to go back and do some work on art history.
Although Mr. Blunt said to ITN in that interview that there were no major talent spotters at Cambridge when he was recruited, he said in a later interview with the Times that talent spotting was the only thing he did at that time. But he said he couldn't reveal how many Cambridge men he spotted because of the Official Secrets Act. The Attorney General, Sir Michael Havers, told the Commons tonight that apart from Anthony Blunt, the authorities have tried to get information from other suspected spies by offering inducement in a few cases. In a guarded answer to a written question from Mr. Dennis Skinner, Sir Michael said it would not be in the public interest to give details. He said that the offer of inducements, whether accepted or not, may have meant that any confessions couldn't be used in criminal proceedings against the suspects. Sir Michael did not make it clear whether any spies did confess and are now safe from prosecution like Mr. Blunt, or whether the authorities failed to learn anything. A former deputy head of MI6, Mr. George Young, watched the Blunt interview with ITN, and afterwards Paul Tilsley asked him how he interpreted it.
Well, I felt the whole occasion was really, as befits an art historian, a very tastefully arranged sackcloth and ashes act. Perhaps that's a little unfair, but I didn't feel there was much of a thread of sincerity running through it, and of course certain question marks. I accept that his statement is written, so to speak, under orders, and probably very carefully checked first by Five and then by the Cabinet Office, but there are still certain ambiguities.
Let's take a few of the points that Blunt made to us in his interview. First of all, do you think that Burgess did recruit him?
That is quite possible. Burgess struck me, I met him as a person with much more initiative and go, as against the somewhat languid historian, and I should think it was Guy who put the idea in his head.
But it's been thought up until now that Blunt was the talent scout for Spies. Can we rule out now totally that Blunt was a talent scout?
No, I don't think so. And what's more, he's rather vague on these particular points. He says there were just the three of us, the other three and myself. Well, how did he know that? Unless he was rather fully aware of the complete effort. I would have thought that his job must have been to keep his eyes and ears open on behalf of the Russians for likely talent. That doesn't necessarily mean to say that Russian intelligence officer was directing him in each stage, but I would have thought that was his main task.
Now, let's look at his war activities. He plays down what he did in the war for Russia, saying that really it was all anti-German anyway. Do you believe him?
Well, it's spies under confession always say what I passed was of little value. It's an old gambit, which they always do. And what his conscience doesn't seem to have been troubled by was the fact that the Russians were the allies of the Germans from the outbreak of war right up to June 1941. They were selling the Russians war materials. They were assisting them in their general industrial effort. They even, as you know, turned over German communists to the Gestapo at their frontier after the Polish campaign was over. So I'm not quite sure how he squares that.
He also says that Philby tipped Burgess and Maclean off that the British were onto them, rather than Blunt.
Yes, this is probably true, if he says that, and said it quite definitely. Philby told me himself, of course, that he had given Guy Burgess a tip, in the sense, he said, I did it because he was a friend of mine, and I simply said, Guy, watch your step, otherwise you might get into trouble. But it may be that Philby did more than that. We're not quite sure about it. I would like to draw attention to Mrs. Thatcher's statement the other day, where she said very definitely that he assisted in the escape of Maclean and Burgess, and that statement was very carefully prepared for her by the security service. So I'm not quite clear, at least I am not quite satisfied with what Blunt said this morning.
He says that he was able to confess because a particular problem was out of the way by 1964. What does he mean by that? Does he mean that Philby had managed to escape to Russia by then, or that Burgess was dead, or something else, that somebody else had died?
Well, Philby had gone quite a year or so ahead, I think, and Burgess died in '63, but it is quite clear, and he admits that himself, that evidence was piling up. So I'm a little sceptical about the idea that some particular event occurred. There were, of course, a number of deaths amongst former security personnel at that time. We were all getting on in years, and people begin to sort of drop off after the age of 50. And it may be that some other friend died who was perhaps involved with him in as a spy group. And so that if he may have felt clear then to confess, since he wasn't compromising somebody else.
But you say there were a number of deaths among security men at that time, people working in the security service.
Yes.
Were they under suspicion at the time, any of these people?
I don't know, to be quite honest. I would be wrong to point a finger at somebody, even if he's dead, so to speak. I would draw attention to the fact that Blunt said he was ordered by the Russians to leave. There's only one conclusion to draw from that, of course, that he could have compromised other people who had not at that time been flushed, and the Russians wanted to get him out. So there were others.
We'll take our first break there in this extended news at 10.